A family dog insists on leading its owner to a secluded cave. Inside, the owner finds something terrifying that changes their understanding of the forest around them. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. Jake Matthews stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, adjusting his worn hiking boots, while Max, his golden retriever, watched expectantly from the doorway. The morning routine felt different today. Maybe it was the way the autumn sun streamed through his apartment windows, or perhaps it was the growing restlessness that had been building over his past 6 months as a software developer. The drive to the trailhead took 30 minutes, with Max's head hanging out the passenger window of Jake's old Subaru. The parking lot was nearly empty, typical for a Wednesday morning. Jake had taken a rare day off, desperate to break free from the endless cycle of Zoom meetings and code reviews that dominated his life. As Jake secured his backpack and checked Max's leash, he couldn't help but think about the monotony that had become his existence. At 32, he had achieved what society deemed successful: a stable job, a comfortable apartment, and a reliable routine. Yet something was missing. His fingers traced the trail map posted at the entrance, following the well-marked paths he had hiked dozens of times before. Max's behavior changed about 2 miles into their hike. The usually well-behaved dog began pulling against his leash with unprecedented force, nearly yanking Jake's arm from its socket. The trail they were on was marked moderate, a path Jake knew well, but Max was veering toward an overgrown section that barely resembled a trail at all. "Max, heel," Jake commanded, but the golden retriever remained uncharacteristically defiant. The dog's tail wagged with intense purpose, and his nose worked overtime, sniffing at something Jake couldn't detect. Against his better judgment, Jake allowed Max to lead him off the maintained trail. The unofficial path twisted through dense undergrowth, forcing Jake to push aside branches and duck under low-hanging limbs. The forest grew denser, the canopy overhead blocking most of the sunlight. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Jake pulled his light jacket closer around his shoulders. After 15 minutes of following Max's determined lead, Jake found himself in a small clearing he had never seen before. The ground was carpeted with thick moss, and the trees seemed older here, their trunks wider and more gnarled than those along the main trail. Max had stopped pulling and stood alert, his attention fixed on something ahead. Jake followed his dog's gaze and froze. Hidden behind a thick curtain of hanging vines and moss was what appeared to be an opening in the rock face, a cave entrance that seemed to have been deliberately concealed by the natural growth around it. The opening was roughly 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, a dark maw in the otherwise solid rock wall. Approaching cautiously, Jake pulled out his phone to check his GPS location, only to find he had no signal. He should have expected as much, given how far they had strayed from the marked trails. The rational part of his brain suggested turning back. Caves could be dangerous, and no one knew where he was. But something about this discovery stirred something deep within him, a longing for the adventure his life had been lacking. Max whined softly, pawing at the ground near the entrance. Jake pulled out his flashlight. He always carried one in his hiking pack, and swept the beam across the cave's entrance. The light revealed smooth, worn steps leading down into the darkness, clearly man-made rather than natural formations. Jake stood at the threshold, conflicting emotions battling within him. His life had become predictable, safe, and utterly boring. Here was something unexpected, something that didn't fit into his carefully organized world. The cave seemed to beckon, promising mysteries and perhaps the adventure he had been craving. "What do you think, buddy?" Jake asked Max, who responded by wagging his tail and taking a few steps toward the entrance. The dog showed no signs of fear or agitation, only curiosity. Jake checked his watch. It was only 11 a.m., plenty of daylight left. He double-checked his backpack. Flashlight, water, trail mix, first aid kit, and extra batteries. He was reasonably well prepared for a short exploration. Taking a deep breath, Jake switched on his flashlight and took his first step into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately, and the sounds of the forest became muffled, replaced by the soft drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Max stayed close to his side, their footsteps echoing slightly on the stone steps. The entrance tunnel was surprisingly regular, almost as if it had been carved with purpose. Jake's flashlight beam revealed walls that were smooth in some places, rough in others, but definitely showing signs of human modification. The air was cool but not stale, suggesting some form of ventilation system. As they descended deeper into the earth, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery would change everything. He had no way of knowing how right he was. The descent continued for roughly 50 feet before the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Jake's flashlight beam caught glimpses of what appeared to be crude shelving carved into the rock walls. Most were empty, but one particular alcove contained something that made Jake pause. A leather-bound book, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Jake approached carefully, aware of the way his footsteps echoed in the chamber. The book was roughly the size of a modern laptop, but much thicker, its leather binding cracked with age but still intact. As he reached for it, he noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Max sat nearby, watching intently, his ears perked forward. Clearing away the dust with his sleeve, Jake revealed what appeared to be a date stamped into the leather. 1872. He carefully opened the cover, wincing at the crackling sound of ancient leather and paper. The first page was filled with neat, handwritten script and fading brown ink. Jake adjusted his flashlight and began to read aloud, his voice seeming unnaturally loud in the cave's silence. Property of Dr. Thomas Blackwood, Scientific Expedition to the Northwestern Territories, Jake read. What follows is a true account of the extraordinary discoveries made in these mountains, though I fear few will believe the testimony I am about to provide. The next several pages detailed standard geological observations, but around page 12, the writing changed. The neat script became more hurried, almost frantic. Jake continued reading. March 15th, 1872. Today we observed something that defies all natural law. The creatures the native peoples spoke of, they are real. Harrison thinks me mad, but I have seen them with my own eyes. They move through the forest like shadows, larger than any known species, yet somehow remaining hidden from most observers. The tribes call them the Old Ones, and claim they have been here since before the first men walked these lands. Jake's voice trailed off as he processed what he was reading. The rational part of his mind wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a 19th century explorer, but something about the urgency in the writing made him pause. He continued reading. March 20th, 1872. The tribal elders have shared their knowledge with me, though they do so reluctantly. They speak of a pact made centuries ago between their people and these beings. The creatures serve as guardians of the forest, maintaining a delicate balance that must not be disturbed. I have been shown evidence that validates their claims, markings that no known animal could make, footprints that defy explanation. A sudden noise from deeper in the cave caused Jake to jump, nearly dropping the book. Max's head snapped up, his ears forward and alert. The sound came again, a soft scraping, like something heavy moving across stone. Jake's flashlight beam darted around the chamber, creating dancing shadows on the walls. March 25th, 1872. I write this in haste. We have gone too far, disturbed what should have remained untouched. Harrison's men began blasting for mineral samples today, despite my protests. The response was immediate and terrifying. The ground trembled, and sounds no human throat could produce echoed through these valleys. 3 men have vanished. The tribal elders warn that worse will come if we do not cease our intrusions. Max suddenly let out a low growl, something Jake had rarely heard from his normally friendly dog. The sound echoed off the cave walls, making it difficult to determine its source. Jake's flashlight beam caught something on the far wall, what appeared to be claw marks scored deep into the solid rock, each groove wide enough to fit his hand. The final entry in the journal was dated March 30th, 1872, written in a shaky hand. To whoever finds this record, heed my warning. These mountains hold secrets that mankind is not ready to face. The tribes are right. There must be places we leave untouched, mysteries we leave unsolved. I leave this journal as testimony and as warning. Some knowledge comes at too great a price. As Jake closed the journal, his hands now visibly shaking, another sound reached his ears, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to come from the very rock around them. Max's growl turned into a series of sharp, urgent barks that bounced off the walls in a cacophony of echoes. Jake quickly stowed the journal in his backpack, his mind racing with implications. The rational explanations he tried to formulate local legends, the imaginings of an overwrought Victorian explorer, natural phenomena, all seemed inadequate in the face of what he was experiencing. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop further, and Jake could have sworn he felt a presence watching from the shadows beyond his flashlight's beam. The sounds were getting closer now, a mixture of scraping stone and something else, something that sounded disturbingly like breathing. Max's barking became more insistent, and Jake could feel his own heart pounding in his chest. Whatever was in this cave with them, it was making its presence known. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, but his curiosity and Max's continued barking held him in place. Sweeping his flashlight along the walls revealed something he'd missed in his initial examination. Intricate carvings covered large sections of the rock face, partially hidden beneath years of mineral deposits. The carvings appeared to tell a story. Primitive but detailed figures showed what appeared to be giant beings interacting with human figures. Jake recognized elements of Pacific Northwest Native American art style, but these weren't the usual salmon or thunderbird motifs he'd seen in museums. These figures were different, more unsettling. "Max, quiet," Jake whispered, trying to steady his voice. The dog's barking subsided to a low whine, but his eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond Jake's flashlight beam. Jake moved closer to the wall, studying the carvings more carefully. Some of the symbols looked like writing, but in no language he recognized. A sudden draft stirred through the chamber, carrying with it a musty, ancient smell. Jake's flashlight beam caught more carvings, these showing what appeared to be a ceremony of some kind. Human figures stood in a circle around a central figure that towered over them, its form deliberately obscured by peculiar spiral patterns. The implications of his discovery began to weigh heavily on Jake's mind. If this cave contained genuine archaeological evidence of Native American culture, it should be protected and studied. But Dr. Blackwood's journal suggested something far more dangerous. Jake found himself facing an unexpected moral dilemma: reveal the cave's existence to authorities and risk whatever consequences the journal warned about, or keep it secret and potentially allow important historical artifacts to remain hidden. More sounds echoed from deeper in the cave system, not the scraping from before, but something that sounded almost like distant voices speaking in an unknown language. Max's fur stood on end, and Jake noticed his own skin was covered in goosebumps, despite his jacket. Moving further along the wall, Jake discovered what appeared to be a map carved into the rock. It showed the mountain range and various cave systems, with this particular cave marked by a distinct spiral symbol. Other markings radiated out from this central point, suggesting this cave held some special significance. Jake pulled out his phone again, hoping to document some of what he was seeing, but the device refused to turn on, despite having been fully charged that morning. The air felt heavier now, almost electrically charged, making the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The distinct sound of footsteps echoed from one of the tunnels leading deeper into the cave system. Heavy footsteps that seemed to make the ground vibrate slightly with each impact. Max's whining grew more intense, and he pressed against Jake's legs, something his brave companion had never done before. Jake's flashlight beam darted toward the source of the sound, but the tunnel curved just beyond its reach. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by what sounded like heavy breathing. Whatever was approaching was large, much larger than any animal Jake knew inhabited these mountains. Fear finally overcame curiosity. "Come on, Max," Jake whispered urgently, beginning to back toward the tunnel they'd entered through. His flashlight beam caught something moving in the darkness, just a glimpse of something massive shifting in the shadows, accompanied by the sound of stone scraping against stone. Max didn't need to be told twice. The golden retriever turned and bolted toward the exit tunnel, with Jake close behind. The sounds behind them increased in volume and intensity, as if whatever was there had noticed their retreat and was picking up speed. Jake's heart pounded as they raced up the stone steps, taking them two at a time. The journal bounced heavily in his backpack, a reminder of the warning it contained. The sounds pursuing them seemed to grow angry, no longer just footsteps, but a cacophony of unnatural noises that echoed through the cave system. The light from the entrance appeared ahead, a grey disk that seemed impossibly far away. Jake's lungs burned as he ran, aware that the sounds behind them were getting closer. Max reached the entrance first, bursting through the curtain of vines into the forest beyond. Jake emerged seconds later, gasping for breath, his clothes damp with sweat despite the cool air. He turned to look back at the cave entrance, his flashlight beam shaking as his hand trembled. For just a moment, he thought he saw something move in the darkness, something that made his mind recoil at its sheer impossibility. Then everything went quiet. The forest sounds slowly returned, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the darkness beyond the cave's entrance. Something that had chosen to let them leave. Max whined softly, nudging Jake's hand with his nose. The dog's usual playful demeanor was gone, replaced by an alertness Jake had never seen before. They needed to get away from here, but Jake knew he couldn't just forget what he'd discovered. The journal in his backpack seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, its secrets now his responsibility. The walk back to the main trail passed in a blur, with Jake constantly looking over his shoulder and Max staying unusually close to his side. As they rounded the final bend before reaching the marked path, they nearly collided with someone, a woman in her mid-30s, wearing hiking boots and carrying scientific equipment. "Oh," she exclaimed, stepping back. "I'm sorry, I didn't expect to see anyone out here." She adjusted her glasses and Jake noticed the logo on her jacket, Pacific Northwest Environmental Research Institute. "I'm Dr. Lisa Chen, conducting a biodiversity survey of the area." Jake noticed she was holding what appeared to be sample collection containers and a digital camera with a specialized lens. Max, usually eager to greet new people, remained uncharacteristically reserved, staying pressed against Jake's leg. "Jake Matthews," he managed, still trying to catch his breath. "And this is Max." He must have looked as shaken as he felt, because concern crossed Lisa's face. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." She paused, noting his disheveled appearance and the dirt on his clothes. "Were you off trail? This area can be dangerous if you don't know it well." Jake hesitated, weighing his options. The rational part of his brain was already trying to normalize what he'd experienced, to find logical explanations. But the journal in his backpack and the fresh memory of those footsteps made such rationalization impossible. "Dr. Chen, Lisa, if I tell you something, will you keep it confidential?" Jake glanced around, lowering his voice despite the empty trail. "I found something that I think you should see, but I'm not sure who to trust with this information." Lisa's professional curiosity clearly piqued. She nodded. "Of course, and please, just call me Lisa. What did you find?" Jake carefully pulled out the journal, watching her eyes widen as she noted its age. "This is just part of it. There's more. A cave system that's not on any map I've seen. There are carvings, evidence of Native American presence, but also..." He trailed off, unsure how to describe the rest without sounding crazy. Lisa carefully examined the journal's cover, her expression growing more serious. "This is remarkable. The preservation is excellent despite its age." She looked up at Jake. "Where exactly did you find this?" "That's the complicated part," Jake said, glancing back toward the unmarked trail. "The cave it came from, there's something about it that doesn't feel right. The journal contains warnings, descriptions of things that sound impossible." Lisa flipped through a few pages, her scientific skepticism visible in her expression until she reached the later entries. Her face paled slightly as she read. "These descriptions, they align with some unusual data we've been collecting in the area." "What kind of data?" Jake asked, Max finally relaxing slightly at his side. Lisa hesitated, then pulled out her tablet. "Over the past 6 months, we've recorded abnormal patterns in wildlife behavior. Animals avoiding certain areas without apparent reason. Unexplained sounds picked up on our acoustic monitors, and seismic readings that don't match known geological patterns." She showed him several charts and graphs that meant little to Jake, but her next words caught his attention. "The most concerning development is that Frontier Mining Corporation has just received preliminary approval for exploratory operations in this area. They're planning to begin core sampling within the month." Jake felt his stomach drop, remembering Dr. Blackwood's final journal entry about the consequences of mining activities. "That can't happen," he said firmly, surprising himself with his conviction. "If what's written in that journal is true, if what I saw in that cave is real." "What exactly did you see in there?" Lisa asked, her voice careful and measured. Jake struggled to find the right words. "Something that shouldn't exist. Something that the journal suggests has been here long before us, protecting these mountains." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I know how this sounds. I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't experienced it." Lisa was quiet for a moment, studying him. "Actually, it might explain some things. The unusual infrared readings we've been getting, the unexplained tracks our team has documented." She looked back toward the direction Jake had come from. "Would you be willing to show me this cave?" Before Jake could respond, Max suddenly growled. Something had rustled in the undergrowth nearby. When they turned to look, Jake caught a glimpse of something moving through the trees, something large enough to shake the branches of fully grown firs. Lisa quickly raised her camera, but whatever it was had already disappeared. She turned to Jake, her scientific skepticism now tinged with uncertainty. "I think you'd better tell me everything you saw in that cave, but not here. My research station isn't far. We should talk there." Jake nodded, acutely aware that his discovery of the cave had set something in motion that he couldn't stop. The journal's weight in his backpack seemed to grow heavier with each step as they headed toward Lisa's station. Max walking between them, still alert and watchful. Lisa's research station turned out to be a well-equipped trailer parked in a designated research area just off the main park road. Inside, computer monitors displayed various environmental data streams, and maps of the region covered one wall. Jake noticed several areas marked with red circles, indicating what Lisa called anomalous activity zones. "We need to document everything before the mining company moves in," Lisa said, pulling up satellite imagery of the area. Their environmental impact assessment was suspiciously rushed, and they've already started moving equipment to their staging area. Jake spread out the journal on Lisa's desk, and they began methodically photographing each page. Max stationed himself by the door, occasionally lifting his head as if catching distant sounds neither human could hear. "Look at this," Lisa said, pointing to a thermal imaging map. "These cold spots, they form a pattern around the area where you found the cave." She overlaid the pattern with the crude map Jake had seen carved into the cave wall. The similarities were striking. They spent the next few hours comparing notes, Lisa's scientific observations with Jake's fresh experience and the journal's historical accounts. The evidence was building. Something unusual was definitely present in these mountains. "We should check the cave's immediate surroundings," Lisa suggested, gathering her equipment. "If there are unusual species in the area, We need to document them before frontier mining destroys their habitat. Jake agreed, though not without apprehension. They headed back toward the cave, this time taking a more systematic approach to examining the surrounding area. Lisa collected soil samples, while Jake photographed unusual markings on trees, deep gouges that seemed to follow a regular pattern. Max suddenly froze, his nose working overtime. Following the dog's lead, they discovered a set of tracks that made Lisa drop her sample collection kit. The impressions in the soft earth were enormous, easily twice the size of any known predator in the region. The stride length alone suggested something that would stand well over 10 feet tall. "This is impossible," Lisa whispered, quickly setting up her camera to document the tracks. "Nothing this size exists in North America. Nothing this size has existed since the Pleistocene era." But there was no denying the evidence before them. The tracks led toward a clearing where the vegetation had been recently disturbed. Large swaths of ferns and undergrowth had been pushed aside, creating what appeared to be a path. "The journal mentioned them as guardians," Jake said, watching Lisa take measurements. "What if they're not just protecting territory, but something specific? Something the mining operation might threaten?" Lisa nodded slowly, reviewing the images on her camera. The ecological damage from mining would be extensive. If there are unknown species in this area, their habitat would be destroyed. But these tracks, she shook her head. This is beyond anything in current scientific literature. A deep rumble, more felt than heard, caused them both to freeze. Max's ears perked up, but surprisingly, he didn't seem afraid. The dog actually wagged his tail slightly, as if recognizing something familiar. "There's more," Jake said quietly, leading them to another clearing. Here they found something that defied explanation, a circle of massive stones, each easily weighing several tons, arranged in a perfect geometric pattern. The stones were covered in the same type of carvings Jake had seen in the cave. Lisa ran her hands over the symbols, her scientific skepticism visibly wrestling with what she was seeing. These stones aren't native to this area. They had to have been brought here. But how? When? The logistics of moving something this size through dense forest. Another rumble, closer this time. The air grew noticeably cooler, and both humans felt that familiar sensation of being watched. Max remained calm, but alert, his eyes fixed on something in the dense forest beyond the stone circle. "We need to make a decision," Jake said, his voice low. "The mining company won't care about any of this. They'll destroy it all without a second thought. But if we go public with what we've found," he let the sentence hang, remembering Dr. Blackwood's warning about knowledge that comes at too great a price. Lisa checked her instruments, which were giving increasingly erratic readings. "Whatever we decide, we need to act fast. Frontier Mining's equipment arrives in less than a week." The rumbling grew louder, and this time there was no mistaking it for distant machinery or natural phenomena. It was a sound that carried intent, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Max suddenly perked up and trotted toward the edge of the clearing, tail wagging. Something had caught his attention, something that left both Jake and Lisa rooted to the spot, their hearts pounding as shadows moved between the ancient trees. The town hall meeting room was packed that Friday evening, with a crowd spilling out into the hallway. Jake sat beside Lisa in the front row, the journal safely stored in his backpack. Max lay at his feet, unusually subdued. Mayor Thompson, a portly man with a perpetual frown, called the emergency meeting to order. "We're here to discuss Frontier Mining's proposed operation," Thompson announced. "They're offering 300 permanent jobs and significant tax revenue for our community." He gestured to a man in an expensive suit, James Morrison, Frontier's regional director. Morrison took the podium, his presentation slick and well-rehearsed. "The environmental impact will be minimal," he assured, showing carefully selected slides. "Our operation will utilize the latest sustainable mining practices." Jake noticed Lisa's knuckles turning white as she gripped her notebook. The scientific data they'd collected over the past few days told a very different story. When Morrison finished, Lisa was the first to stand. "Dr. Lisa Chen, Pacific Northwest Environmental Research Institute, she introduced herself. Your environmental impact assessment fails to account for several critical factors. She presented her findings about unique flora and geological formations, carefully omitting any mention of the inexplicable tracks or the cave's stranger aspects. Morrison dismissed her concerns with practiced ease. Our studies show no endangered species in the area. The economic benefits far outweigh any minor environmental disruption. Then Jake stood, his heart pounding. He'd practiced this moment, trying to figure out how to present their discoveries without sounding crazy. I'm Jake Matthews. 3 days ago, I found something in those mountains that changes everything. He pulled out the journal, watching Morrison's confident smile falter slightly. This journal from 1872 documents previous mining attempts in the area, Jake continued. They were abandoned after several unexplained incidents. There are also Native American artifacts that deserve proper archaeological study. A murmur ran through the crowd. Sarah, Running Deer, an elderly member of the local tribal council, leaned forward in her seat. But before Jake could continue, Bill Carson, the owner of the local hardware store, stood up. We're supposed to give up jobs and progress because of some old book, Carson demanded. This town is dying. My kids had to move away because there's no work here. Frontier mining is offering us a future. Several people voiced agreement. Jake looked around the room, seeing the desperation in many faces. These were people struggling to make ends meet, watching their community slowly fade away as younger generations left for better opportunities. The jobs won't matter if the environmental damage destroys the tourism industry, Lisa argued. The hiking trails, fishing spots, camping areas, all of it will be compromised. The debate grew heated. Morrison maintained his professional smile, but Jake noticed him exchanging worried glances with Mayor Thompson. Something about the journal had rattled him. Sarah Running Deer finally spoke, her quiet voice somehow cutting through the chaos. Our people have stories about those mountains, she said, about guardians who protect the land, about boundaries that should not be crossed. Morrison's smile turned condescending. With all due respect, we can't base modern economic decisions on folk tales. Suddenly, Max's head shot up. The dog stood, hackles raised, and began barking at the hall's windows. Outside, the evening sky had turned an unusual shade of green. A deep vibration ran through the building, rattling windows and coffee cups. The crowd fell silent. In that silence, a sound carried from the direction of the mountains, a sound that made Morrison's practiced smile finally slip completely. It wasn't quite a roar, wasn't quite thunder, but it shook something primitive in everyone who heard it. That's no folktale, Jake said into the silence. Whatever's up there, it's real, and it's telling us to stay away. Sarah Running Deer nodded slowly, but most of the crowd looked torn between fear and disbelief. Morrison quickly tried to regain control of the narrative, suggesting the sound was probably just mining equipment being moved into place. But Jake could see doubt creeping into people's eyes. The journal's warnings seemed more real now, more immediate. The question was whether the town's economic desperation would outweigh their growing unease. As if in answer, another rumble shook the building, closer this time. Max's barking grew more intense, and the dog moved to the hall's entrance, positioning himself as if standing guard. The meeting dissolved into chaos, with half the crowd calling for immediate action to stop frontier mining, while others desperately clung to the promise of economic salvation. In the midst of it all, Jake noticed Sarah Running Deer watching him with knowing eyes. She approached slowly, her voice meant only for him and Lisa. You've seen them, haven't you? The Guardians. Before Jake could respond to Sarah Running Deer's question, the town hall's double doors burst open. A gust of unnaturally cold air swept through the room, and a figure stepped into the doorway, tall, lean, wearing what appeared to be traditional Native American clothing mixed with modern outdoor gear. The stranger's presence commanded immediate attention, silencing the heated debates. Even Max stopped barking, instead offering a soft whine of recognition. The man appeared to be in his 50s, but his eyes held an age that seemed far older. "My name is Daniel Walking Bear," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the hushed room. "I speak for those who cannot be here themselves." He walked directly to where Jake and Lisa stood, completely ignoring Morrison and the mayor. "You found the cave," he said to Jake. "It wasn't a question. And you read Blackwood's warnings." His eyes moved to Lisa. "And you've documented the signs." Morrison attempted to regain control of the situation. "Sir, this is a closed town meeting. This was our land long before it was your town." Daniel cut him off without even looking in his direction. "The treaties your government signed with our people included promises about certain places that would remain untouched. Places your mining company now threatens." Sarah Running Deer nodded slowly. "He speaks truth. The sacred sites that aren't documented in any official survey." Morrison interrupted, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Daniel Walking Bear finally turned to face the mining representative. "They were not documented because they were never meant to be found by those who would exploit them. The Guardians see to that." As if on cue, another rumble shook the building, this one strong enough to knock books from shelves and send coffee cups crashing to the floor. Outside, the strange green light in the sky intensified. "The beings you call myths have watched over these mountains since the ice retreated," Daniel continued. "They allowed humans to live here under certain conditions. Your ancestors," he looked at Sarah, "understood this. They respected the boundaries." Jake pulled out the journal. "Blackwood mentioned a pact sealed in blood and stone." Daniel nodded. "When your mining machines break that stone, you will break that pact. The consequences will be severe." Morrison had had enough. "This is ridiculous. You can't honestly expect us to believe." A sound cut through the night. Not the earlier rumble, but a clear, distinct call that made every person in the room feel suddenly small and vulnerable. Max pressed against Jake's leg, no longer scared but seemingly aware of something momentous. "They're angry," Daniel said simply. "The test drilling your company did last week disturbed their sleep. That was just a taste of their displeasure." "The missing equipment," Lisa suddenly said. "The drill that disappeared. Mechanical failure." Morrison insisted weakly. "It fell into a natural crevasse." "It was a warning," Daniel said. "The next one will not be so gentle." He turned back to Jake and Lisa. "You two have been chosen. The Guardians allowed you to find the cave, to read the journal. They're offering you the chance to prevent what's coming." Sarah Running Deer stepped forward. "In our stories, the Guardians always choose outsiders as their messengers, those who can bridge the gap between worlds." Another call echoed from the mountains. Closer now. The town hall's lights flickered, and through the windows, strange shadows moved across the unnaturally green sky. "You have until the new moon," Daniel said gravely. 3 days to stop what's coming. After that, the Guardians will protect their domain as they see fit. And believe me," he looked directly at Morrison, "you don't want to see how they protect what's theirs." As if to emphasize his point, a final rumble shook the building, strong enough to crack several windows. When the chaos subsided, Daniel Walking Bear had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. The town hall erupted in confused discussion, but Jake noticed something that others missed. Footprints in the dust where Daniel had stood. Footprints that seemed to shift and change even as he watched, until they resembled the massive tracks they'd found in the forest. Early the next morning, Jake and Lisa followed Daniel's tracks into the forest. Max led the way, seeming to know exactly where they were heading. The morning mist clung to the trees, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that matched their mission. They found Daniel at what appeared to be an ancient gathering place, a natural amphitheater formed by weathered stone, with petroglyphs covering the rock faces. He sat cross-legged in the center, burning sage in an intricate clay bowl. "The mining company isn't your real concern," Daniel said as they approached. "They're just the latest in a long line of threats to this place. What matters is understanding why the Guardians chose you. Lisa pulled out her research notes. The data pattern suggests something massive has been moving through these mountains for years, possibly centuries. But how could something so large remain hidden? Daniel smiled. The same way they've always hidden, by existing in the spaces between what you call reality. They step into your world only when necessary, when the balance is threatened. Jake removed the journal from his backpack. Blackwood wrote about a ritual, something about maintaining the balance. The renewal, Daniel nodded. Every generation, the Guardians choose new protectors, people who can walk between their world and ours. Blackwood was chosen, but he ran from the responsibility. That's why he left the journal, hoping someone braver would find it. He stood, revealing his full height, and gestured for them to follow. They walked deeper into the amphitheater, where the petroglyphs began to tell a story. The images showed human figures standing before massive, shadowy forms, receiving what appeared to be some kind of knowledge or power. Our ancestors didn't just make a pact with the Guardians, Daniel explained. They became part of their world. Some of us still carry that ancient blood. He looked meaningfully at Jake. Some who don't even know their own heritage. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? Your grandmother's maiden name was Running Deer, Daniel said simply. Sarah recognized you immediately. The Guardians didn't choose you by chance, Jake Matthews. They called to their own. Lisa looked between them, her scientific mind visibly struggling with these revelations. But what about me? I'm not connected to any of this. You represent the new world, Daniel replied. The bridge between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge. The Guardians understand that their old ways of protection aren't enough anymore. They need people who can fight with data and laws, not just ceremonies and traditions. He led them to a hidden cave entrance, different from the one Jake had discovered. Inside, the walls were covered with sophisticated astronomical charts carved into the stone, overlaid with mathematical equations that looked centuries ahead of their time. Your ancient people were advanced astronomers, Lisa breathed, examining the carvings. The Guardians taught us many things, Daniel said. Knowledge that was lost when your people forced us onto reservations. But some secrets were kept safe, passed down through generations who maintained the old pacts. He turned to face them both. The Guardians aren't just protecting land or resources. They're protecting knowledge. Knowledge that humanity wasn't ready for then, and maybe isn't ready for now. But they're running out of options. A distant roar echoed through the cave, but this time it felt less threatening, more like a greeting. Max's tail wagged in response. The choice is yours, Daniel said. You can walk away, like Blackwood did. But the Guardians chose you because they believe you're different, that you'll make the right choice. He pulled out 2 small stone pendants, each carved with symbols matching those on the cave walls. These will mark you as chosen protectors. Wearing them means accepting responsibility for what comes next. Jake and Lisa exchanged looks. The weight of the decision pressed down on them like the mountain itself. Outside, the mining company's machines were moving into position. Time was running out. The pendants seemed to pulse with their own inner light, waiting for their answer. The next morning, the sound of heavy machinery echoed through the valley. Frontier Mining wasn't waiting for the town's final approval. From their vantage point on the ridge, Jake and Lisa watched as a convoy of equipment moved toward the proposed mining site. Both wore their stone pendants, hidden under their clothes, but somehow feeling warmer against their skin as the trucks approached. They're starting at 3 different locations, Lisa said, checking her tablet. The main site is too close to the cave system. Any blasting could destabilize the entire network. She touched her pendant unconsciously, and her tablet screen flickered with strange symbols for a moment before returning to normal. Jake felt a deep vibration through the soles of his boots, not from the machinery, but from something else, something responding to the invasion of its territory. Max growled softly, his eyes fixed on the tree line where shadows seemed to move against the wind. "We need to try one more time to stop this legally," Jake said, pulling out his phone. Local news fans were already gathering at the site, drawn by rumors of protests. Sarah Running Deer had mobilized the tribal council, and environmental activists were arriving by the hour. They drove down to the staging area where a confrontation was building. Morrison stood with Mayor Thompson, both looking uncomfortable as protesters gathered. The mining company had brought private security, their black uniforms and dark sunglasses adding to the tension. "This is private property now," Morrison announced through a megaphone. "Anyone interfering with company operations will be arrested." "These lands were never yours to sell," Sarah Running Deer called back, her voice carrying surprising strength. Other tribal elders stood with her, many wearing traditional regalia. Some carried signs protesting the destruction of sacred sites. Lisa stepped forward, holding up official documents. "Your permits are based on incomplete environmental surveys. We have evidence of protected species in the area." She had compiled their findings into a devastating report, carefully omitting any mention of the Guardians, while highlighting numerous violations of environmental regulations. Morrison's security team moved to block her, but several news cameras swung in their direction. He was forced to accept the documents, his face tightening as he skimmed them. "These are serious allegations," a EPA representative who had just arrived said, reaching for the report. "We may need to halt operations pending review." "We can't afford any delays," Morrison snapped. "We have contracts to fulfill." He nodded to his operations manager, and the machines roared to life. The first excavator began tearing into the earth, drawing shouts of protest from the crowd. Then everything changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, frost forming on the machinery despite the warm morning. The sky darkened, as if a storm was gathering, but the clouds moved against the wind, swirling in impossible patterns. Max barked once, a clear warning, seconds before the first tremor hit. It wasn't like a normal earthquake. The ground seemed to pulse, like something massive was moving deep below. The mining equipment's electronics went haywire, screens flashing with strange symbols similar to those in the cave. "Stop the machines!" Jake shouted, but it was too late. The largest excavator had struck something, not rock, but something that rang out with a sound like an enormous bell being struck. The vibration shattered windows in the mining company's temporary buildings. Morrison's face had gone pale. "Keep going," he ordered, but his voice shook. The operators looked uncertain, especially as more tremors rocked the area. A sound rolled down from the mountains, the same sound they'd heard at the town hall, but impossibly louder now. Birds erupted from the trees in massive flocks. Even the protesters fell silent, feeling the primitive part of their brains screaming that something ancient and powerful had awakened. The shadows between the trees were moving again, but this time they didn't retreat. Forms began to take shape, forms that made the mind struggle to comprehend their scale and nature. The security teams raised their weapons, then dropped them as primal fear overcame training. "It's your last chance," Jake said to Morrison, his pendant now burning hot against his chest. "Stop now, or they'll stop you themselves." Morrison looked between the approaching shadows and his precious machinery, greed wrestling with terror on his face. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone to call his corporate office. The shadows continued to emerge from the forest, and this time, everyone could see them. Thunder rolled across the darkened sky as Morrison made his call, but no rain fell. The shadows from the forest had become more distinct, massive forms that seemed to shift between solid matter and living darkness. Their movement defied natural law, simultaneously fluid and angular, each step crossing more distance than should be possible. "Shut it down," Jake heard Morrison whisper into his phone. "Shut it all down, now." But before the operators could power down their machines, a bolt of that strange green lightning struck the main excavator. Instead of causing damage, the lightning seemed to reveal something. For a brief moment, everyone saw the true form of what they had nearly disturbed. Beneath the mining site lay something that looked like a vast geometric pattern, pulsing with its own inner light. It wasn't technology, wasn't simple mineral deposits, but something far more fundamental, as if they were seeing the underlying structure of reality itself. The Guardians reached the edge of the clearing. In the strange light, their forms finally became clear enough to process, though looking at them directly still caused a deep, instinctive vertigo. They stood easily 30 feet tall, their bodies an impossible blend of light and shadow, ancient stone and living forest. Their movements left traces of that geometric pattern in the air, like tears in the fabric of everyday reality. Lisa's scientific equipment was going haywire, detecting radiation patterns that shouldn't exist, energy readings that broke known laws of physics. Her pendant grew brighter, and suddenly she could see what the readings meant. The Guardians weren't just creatures, they were living connections between different layers of reality. Then the largest of them spoke. The sound wasn't in English, wasn't in any human language, but Jake and Lisa understood. Their pendants translated not just words but concepts, flooding their minds with understanding. The seal must not be broken, the Guardian communicated. What sleeps below must continue to sleep. This is the pact, written in stone and stars. Jake felt memories that weren't his own surge through his mind. Generations of his ancestors keeping watch, maintaining the balance. He saw Blackwood's encounter, saw why the man had fled rather than accept the responsibility. The knowledge was overwhelming, showing him both the tremendous power and the heavy burden of being a Guardian's chosen. Lisa received different visions, mathematical equations that unified physics in ways her scientific mind had never imagined. Biological principles that showed life itself was far more complex and interconnected than humanity had realized. She saw how the Guardian's presence maintained patterns essential to the planet's survival. Max, surprisingly calm, walked forward to meet the Guardians. They acknowledged him with what could only be described as respect. Animals, it seemed, had always been able to see them clearly. Morrison and his people fled, leaving their equipment behind. The protesters watched in awe as the Guardians began to restore the land, their mere presence accelerating the growth of new vegetation over the scarred earth. The choice stands. The Guardian communicated to Jake and Lisa. You have seen what we protect. Will you join us as Guardians of the Seal? The pendants pulsed, offering them their destinies. Jake thought of his former life, the comfortable monotony he'd been so eager to escape. Lisa considered her scientific career, realizing this would change everything she thought she knew about the natural world. As they stepped forward to accept their roles, the Guardians revealed one final truth. Jake and Lisa weren't just being asked to protect a place or a secret. They were being invited to become part of something that had existed since the dawn of time. A living bridge between the world humanity knew and the deeper realities that lay behind it. The green light intensified one last time, and in that moment, both Jake and Lisa understood that their ordinary lives were over. But what replaced them would be beyond anything they could have imagined. And Max, tail wagging, seemed to know all along that this was exactly where they were meant to be. The story concludes with the truth of the cave finally revealed. Not just a simple hollow in the rock, but a gateway to understanding that some places in the world still hold mysteries deeper than humanity's current knowledge can grasp. Jake and Lisa became part of that mystery, joining an ancient lineage of protectors who walked the boundary between worlds. The ancient pact was renewed, and the mountains kept their secrets. But now they had new guardians to help protect them, proving that even in the modern world, some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious, guarded by those who understand that not all knowledge is meant to be owned, but rather preserved for the time when humanity is finally ready to understand it.